your guide to Australian property. Zoning in relation to property refers to the nature of a property and its intended use. There are 6 main zones in Australia: residential, commercial, industrial, mixed use, agricultural, and public use. For each state, there are more specific zoning codes varying in popularity. Let's have a look at these. The New South Wales property zoning, for instance, includes R1, known as general residential, R2, or low density residential, R3, medium density residential, R4, high density residential, R5, large lot or rural residential, and B4, mixed use. In New South Wales, the New South Wales Department of Planning and Environment is responsible for property zoning. In 2006, this body created Standard Instrument Local Environment Plan, or LEP, that guides the planning decisions for local governments. This greatly simplified the zoning laws, as before it was passed, local governments were using approximately 3,100 different land zones. Incredible, right? Let's look at the Australian Capital Territory, or ACT, property zoning now. The zone codes include RZ1, or Suburban Zone, RZ2, Suburban Core Zone, RZ3, Urban Residential Zone, RZ4, Medium Density Residential Zone, and RZ5, High Density Residential Zone. The ACT Government Environment and Planning Office oversees territory land zoning. What about Queensland property zoning? The Queensland Department of State Development, Infrastructure and Planning doesn't have uniform zoning codes for each part of the state, which is interesting. The following zone codes are used in Victoria property zoning: RGZ, or Residential Growth Zone; GRZ, General Residential Zone; NRZ, Neighbourhood Residential Zone; C1Z, Commercial 1 Zone; C2Z, Commercial 2 Zone; LDRZ, Low Density Residential Zone; MUZ, Mixed Use Zone; TZ, Township Zone; and RLZ, Rural Living Zone. The Victoria Department of Transport, Planning and Local Infrastructure manages the growth of the state. They have created a Melbourne Metro planning strategy, as well as 8 regional growth plans to provide a comprehensive strategy to local councils for land use. The planning zones have recently been reformed. After deleting 9 existing zones, they created 5 new ones and amended another 12. Moving on to WA and SA property zoning. The Western Australian Planning Commission and the South Australian Department of Planning, Transport and Infrastructure respectfully handle property zoning in Western Australia and South Australia. As with Queensland, they do not have uniform zoning codes. And lastly, Northern Territory property zoning codes include SD, or commonly known as Single Dwelling Residential, MD, or Multiple Dwelling Residential, MR, Medium Density Residential, HR, High Density Residential, RR, Rural Residential, RL, Rural Living, FD, Future Development, and CB, Central Business, which permits some residential development. The development of lands, planning, and the environment has a planning scheme, which, while outlining numerous planning codes, holds the above as its most popular property zoning codes. In relation to zoning, the following laws are applicable for each state: Australian Capital Territory, or ACT, Territory Plan of 2008, Northern Territory, or NT, Planning Act of 1999, New South Wales Environmental Planning and Assessment Act of 1979, Queensland Sustainable Planning Act of 2009, which was repealed followed by the Planning Act of 2016, South Australia Development Act of 1993, Tasmania Land Use Planning and Approval Acts of 1993, Victoria Planning and Environment Act of 1987, and Western Australia Planning and Development Act of 2005. We have now examined the basics of real property from zoning to title to ownership. Next, we'll discuss what to do before you purchase a property. We'll go through a helpful checklist of what you should do before you buy and other important information associated with buying a property. Property purchasing before you buy. We'll be discussing the contract for sale, buying on your terms, inspections, inclusions in the sale, exchange and signing the contract, settlement, and mortgages. Let's start with the contract for sale. When you buy a property in Australia, your rights depend largely on what is in the contract for the sale. No two properties are the same, and therefore no two contracts will be the same either. However, there are some things a contract for sale must do, including properly identifying the property for sale as well as the terms on which it is being sold. It should also attach several documents, the most common of which are a zoning certificate, a drainage diagram showing any sewer lines, a copy of the property certificate, a copy of the plan for the land, and copies of any documents showing easements, which is the right of someone else to cross or use the land, rights of way, restrictions, covenants, etc. Sellers of strata properties, which are generally units or townhouses, should also have attached a copy of the property certificate and strata plan, and a copy of bylaws concerning the use of common property. What about buying on your terms? Many of the terms in any contract for sale will be standard ones, which means that they have been in use for a long time and are fair to both the vendor or seller and purchaser or buyer. However, a seller does not have to include these terms and instead may choose to include something in the contract which favors themselves at the expense of the buyer. That is why it is important to make sure that the contract for sale is not only legal, but that it is also not unfair to you as the purchaser. Where a clause is not in your interests, you should negotiate with the seller to have it changed. This includes working out an optimal time to settle on the sale, which is when you will pay the balance, owing and taking ownership of the property. Inspections are also very important. Because you are expected to take the property as you find it, that means you will also sign up to any structural problems, pest infestations, or other defects that might not be obvious to the naked eye. That's why it's always best to have someone who knows what they're doing look over the property first. After all, you may be paying a few $100s up front to save yourself thousands, or even tens of thousands of dollars down the track if there are major structural problems. You should also check whether the contract includes a survey, a building certificate, or a homeowner's warranty insurance certificate for any renovations done at the property. If you're buying at auction, it is important that you have any pest or building inspections carried out before the auction. Once the hammer falls, it is unlikely you'll be able to get out of the contract. Let's look at sale inclusions. Unless the contract specifically says otherwise, the property will be sold in the state you find it in. That also means any fixtures are automatically included. A fixture is anything that cannot easily be taken away without doing damage to the property. For instance, stoves are usually fixtures because they are wired in, whereas fridges are not because they only need to be unplugged. Sometimes, a seller will attempt to exclude a fixture from the contract for sale. At other times, what constitutes a fixture is not so clear-cut. For instance, removable floor coverings or an above-ground pool. Where anything is in doubt, it should be expressly included in the contract for sale. Please ask the real estate agent if you're not sure. What about your mortgage documents? To buy a property, most people will need to take out a mortgage. A mortgage gives a lender right over the land for which they are lending money, including the option of selling it if you default on the loan. Most buyers consult with their preferred bank or mortgage broker when they start to look at properties, so that they know how much the bank or financial institution will lend them. It's important to ask if you'll be penalized for refinancing or paying out your loan early. The property purchase, how it works. Let's discuss exchange at the time of signing the contract. A contract to sell a property becomes binding when the buyer and seller each sign a copy of the contract for sale and exchange them. At exchange, the buyer also usually hands over a deposit, often 10%, but this is usually negotiable. At an auction, exchange happens immediately after the winning bid is accepted. For private treaty sales, exchange usually means that you will deliver your signed contract to the seller's agent and pick up the seller's signed copy. Sometimes a seller will be happy to exchange contracts by mail, in which case the seller's signed contract will be delivered to you or your solicitor. Often contracts are finalized electronically for convenience. Then there's signing the contract. Sometimes it's possible that a purchaser can get out of the contract for sale and get their deposit back, even when they have signed the contract for sale. That includes buying a property at auction. For instance, sellers must always comply with the vendor disclosure agreements and warranties. These rules force anyone selling a property to let prospective buyers know certain information about the property they are selling in the contract for sale. This includes making promises about the property and attaching certificates that reveal such things as any rights of way, drainage, and zoning. There is also a cooling off period, generally after signing a contract for the sale of a property. The cooling off period can give you peace of mind that you have the option to back out of the sale if you're having doubts after you've signed the contract. Standard cooling off periods varies from state to state, and not all types of property sales have a cooling off period. So it pays to be informed before you put an offer on a property. Now, let's look at settlement. When you sign the contract, you will usually agree to a settlement day. Most commonly, this will be 6 weeks after the date of exchange of contracts. At settlement, you will need to pay the seller everything you owe them to settle the purchase of the property. This amount will consider any utility bill and tax calculations that your solicitor makes. If you cannot settle by the date stipulated in the contract for sale, you're likely to be charged interest. In some circumstances, the seller might even be able to cancel the sale and keep your deposit. You should let your solicitor know as soon as possible if it looks like you cannot make the settlement date, so that they can attempt to come to an arrangement with the seller's solicitor. Do you need to be present at the settlement? You do not usually need to attend the settlement in person. Instead, your solicitor and the seller's solicitor will meet to make sure they have everything they need for the sale to go ahead. If you are taking out a mortgage to pay for the property, a representative of your bank, as well as the seller's bank, will also attend settlement. Once that happens, your solicitor will call or email you to let you know you are the proud owner of a new home or property. As you've heard, there's a lot to consider when you're purchasing a property, including price, location, and all of the legal aspects of purchasing. I hope what we've discussed helps you understand the process a bit better. Next, we'll look at property investment, along with issues and considerations to be aware of when investing in property. Please let us know if you have any questions. We'd be happy to advise and assist you if you're considering buying or selling your property in Australia. Bye for now.